Well, once again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural edition of our Insight series of webcasts here at One Identity. And sort of a little nervous. This is our first foray into this, so we're still sort of working the bugs out. But I think we'll have a good bit of time together. My name is George Sorbonne. I'm a principal solutions architect here at One Identity. And what we're going to talk about today is how you can expand your on-premise implementation of identity to the cloud and help to get IAM right. Specifically, we're going to talk today about a product that we've had in market for a long, long time on the on-prem world, which is a product called Active Roles. And I'm sure lots of you are familiar with it and may have used it on-prem. But today we're going to talk specifically about how we can use it to extend to the hybrid cloud. How we can enable kind of a single pane of glass, a single scope of administration for users both who are on-prem and who are up in the cloud in Azure. We'll go through a couple quick slides just to kind of set the framework a little bit, and then we'll jump right into a demo, and I'll walk through how we can configure some of this stuff. So I'll kind of begin by saying, Azure Active Directory has been around for quite a while now. Initially it was sort of released as part of Office 365 and being used kind of behind the scenes. But as more and more organizations are adopting more and more of the Azure platform, it's becoming a larger and larger important portion of their IT infrastructure. Having said that, though, although we call it Azure Active Directory, there's lots of stuff that's kind of similar to our on-prem Active Directory, and there's lots of stuff that's a little bit different. So today, kind of my goal is to go through, maybe do a little bit of education for some of the folks on the phone who may not know too much about Azure Active Directory and how some of the things that it does in there. And then we'll walk through how we can configure active roles to be able to provision and deprovision and manage users and groups up in the cloud space. So it should be a lot of fun, and we'll go ahead and get started. So kind of conceptually, the idea of what we want to do here is we want to provide an administrator a single pane of glass. Without active roles, administrators are forced to kind of use some fairly cumbersome tools, kind of the same way Active Roles provides a nice clean interface for Active Directory users and computers. We wanted to be able to provide that same kind of look and feel and that same kind of experience in the cloud infrastructure in Azure Active Directory. Some of the challenges in doing that are the concepts are a little bit different. As you'll see as we go through some of this stuff, there's lots of stuff that's similar, but there's a bunch of things that are kind of different. But as conceptually, this is the idea: is that Active Roles becomes your single console for managing both the on-prem environment and then the cloud type environment. Now we've had this for a while inside of Active Roles. We had kind of plugins to manage different components. We had the plugin for Office 365, and it was fine sort of back in the day when we were only doing a little bit of administration going into the cloud environment. But going forward, we see that more and more organizations are adopting cloud in kind of a rich way, and kind of that plug-in architecture where we have a kind of this logical separation between what we're doing in one platform and another just kind of isn't cutting it anymore. And so we here at One Identity kind of recognized that need a while back and said, well, we're going to have to start to build some things in order to manage this and in order to deal with it. And so Active Roles 7.1 is kind of our first sort of steps into this kind of environment. It supports the idea of Office 365/Azure, and I'll talk about that in a second. Groups like users and groups, supports your basic kind of CRUD operations, your basic provisioning, deprovisioning, and it uses the native the Azure native Graph API, which is nice. We're not going through any kind of a translation layer or anything along those lines, so we get the full power and full support. That's Microsoft's kind of recommended approach for how you do these things. And we've also got built-in support for license management, and I'll show you kind of what that looks like in a minute. Kind of a note here, just for some of the folks who may not be familiar with it. Everybody who's using Office 365 is using Azure Active Directory, even if they don't know it. And for lots of organizations, that's kind of their first foray into Azure AD. That's really kind of the driving factor. And so you'll see kind of this phrasing of Office 365/Azure, but they really kind of are almost managed somewhat independently of each other. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like a little bit. Just want to show one quick architecture slide, and then we'll sort of jump into our demo. This is kind of the conceptual environment of how the architecture works. We have kind of our new web-based front end that was introduced, I think, in 7.0, and we'll get to take a look at that as we go through our demo. That web interface talks to the Active Roles ADC provider, which in turn talks to Active Role Server. And then Active Role Server manages the connections to whatever we need to go to, whether it's into the Active Directory or whether it's through the Graph API into Azure AD. The other thing to be aware of is there's another component that Azure provides called Azure AD Connect, and it provides a mechanism to kind of synchronize your on-prem Active Directory with your directory in the cloud. We don't really need to use that as part of Active Roles, but if you're using it already, there's some value we can add, and I'll explain that as we kind of go through the scenario. So I promised just a couple of slides. That sort of frames the conversation. Let me go ahead and open up my, my screen here, and we can take a look at our environment. Okay. Move that over there like that. Okay, great. So this is the Active Roles administrative web console. And so this is, if you used kind of an older version, you might be familiar with the MMC plugins. We still are going to use some of those, but we're moving more and more toward this Active Roles web console kind of environment. If I open up the Directory Management tab here, you'll see we have the ability to set up an Azure configuration. And I've sort of deliberately not configured it because I want to walk through it with you. Now, Azure Active Directory is not really, it introduces some new concepts. And so some of these things can be a little bit confusing. And so I want to walk through, as part of this, how you can get some information out of your Azure environment. The other thing that I'm going to recommend is we're going to need to use a service account in order to connect up into the Azure environment. I strongly recommend, as you're going through and before you begin doing your configuration, that you test that service account to make sure that it's working. And the way I found the best way to do that is to launch Internet Explorer and start in private browsing. This will make sure that there's no cached credentials or anything along those lines, that we're doing a fresh installation or a fresh login, and we're reasonably confident that it's going to work at that point. So I'm going to browse out to my Azure instance. Here, and I'm going to go out to portal.azure.com, and it's going to prompt me for my login credentials. And so I'm going to use the service account that I'm planning to use later, which is ars_sbc@georgeserbone.com, and I'm going to use the password that I think it is, and we'll go ahead. Oop, I mistyped something. I have this backwards. There we go. Much better. Okay, so now we're logging into Azure, and you'll notice there's a variety of stuff on the left-hand side of the portal here. The thing that I'm interested in is my Azure Active Directory. And the reason we're doing this now is because there's going to be some information we're going to need, and it can be a little difficult sometimes to find where we're going to want, where we need to go in order to get this info. And so I'm going to show you kind of the easiest way to do it. You'll notice there's a bunch of stuff on the side here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to want to go down to domain names, and we're going to click into domain names, and these are all the domains that are registered with this Azure tenant. So it's important to understand kind of there's a hierarchy of objects inside of Azure. At the top level, you have a tenant, and the tenant is the first thing that you register. And then a tenant is going to have one or more domains underneath it. We're going to need this information when we connect up with Active Roles. And so the key thing here is it'll typically look something like this: somestring.onmicrosoft.com. And if we click in and we take a look at it, you'll see it is the initial domain. That's the piece that we're going to need, and we're going to want to know sort of later on as we go at it. So I need to know kind of what my tenant name is, and that's where I'm going to pull this from. The other thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to need to know what our tenant ID is. And the tenant ID is this very long GUID of information. And it can be very difficult to find. The easiest thing to do is to come down to this properties tab. And if you click here, you'll see this directory ID. And we're going to need this a couple of times during our implementation. And so I'm going to go ahead and click to copy and just copy it and have it available. So, okay, I've got my basic information, and now I'm ready to connect up to Azure. So I'm going to log in back to my Azure configuration. And in my command window here, I'm going to add a new Azure tenant. And you can see here's where I need to pull my information from. So I'm going to be, my tenant name is George Cerbone on Microsoft.com. And it's important to note here that you're going to have to get this stuff kind of exactly. So active roles and Azure in general isn't really tolerant of mistakes here. And so it's important to kind of look up and verify your information before you get started. It's also important to note that this is the tenant name. This isn't the domain name. So, you know, I've got a different domain associated with it, but that's why we had to go and figure that stuff out. The tenant ID is going to be that GUID that we used, that we got earlier. And so we've got that. And then I need an administrator username. This person or this administrator needs to be a global administrator on your tenant. And so you just need to make sure that's set up ahead of time. And so I think I did. And then the password. And I'm going to take my own advice and just double check and make sure that I have that user correct. So I'll go into all users, and there it is. It's SVC_ARS, and let's make sure that's what I did. And it is, and I'll put in my password. And then you can also give it a description. So we'll call this. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and click finish. And behind the scenes, active roles is going to go and start pulling down some information. Now at this point, I've told active roles to connect up to my tenant, but I want to make sure that I was able to successfully do that. And the easiest way to do that is to come down and take a look at these Azure Domains tab. And if I tick into Azure Domains and I see the domains that I've already configured and I know these are the correct ones, then I know that I've been able to successfully authenticate into my tenant and pull that information down. If you don't see anything here, something's gone wrong. And so you might want to double check your password and double check your tenant name and your GUID and all those kinds of things. And then go ahead and reconnect. But at this point, I know that I've connected up properly. The next thing I need to do is I want to create an Azure application. So we'll go ahead and set this up, and this is going to be the application that's going to allow me to synchronize up into Azure. There's lots of concepts that are kind of new in Azure because it's built on kind of a web sort of framework, and it's using an OAuth authentication module. So whereas in Active Directory we just need a username and password, you'll see that in Azure AD things are a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and add an Azure application. And again, I can name it kind of whatever I want. So I'll just call this Active Roles Sync. And I will stick this like this. Active Role Sync. And then again, I'm going to need that tenant ID, which I copied earlier. And I will go ahead and click Finish here. And so it's gone and it's created the application. And if I want to, I can go back over to Azure. And if I go back to my my core area, let's do it this way. Azure Active Directory, and we'll go to app registrations. And you'll see here's my Active Roles Sync application, and it's gone in here. Now, this application, when we register it, one of the kind of quirks about Azure is that we request permissions. And so I'll show you inside of here. If I take a look at this Active Roles Sync, and if I want to look at required permissions, you'll see it's got a whole set of permissions that have been associated with it. However, you'll notice we've got this tab in here that says requires admin. this application requires that an administrator sign in and essentially allow this application to have these permissions. And so it's kind of an Azure thing. See, there's an additional step that we have to do here. Even though we've created the app and Azure took care, Active Roles took care of it, we're going to go in and we're going to take a look at our Azure app. And you'll notice there's this consent URL that we put down here. And this is a pretty common paradigm inside of Azure AD permissions. And so all we're going to do is we're going to grab that consent URL. We're going to drop it in a web browser, and you'll see it's going to prompt me to authenticate. And this is one of those times when it's better to use a private window. But I'll use this tab here. This is the account that I'm using. We'll put in my password, and you'll see it's going to prompt me and say, hey, this application needs this set of permissions. And again, Active Roles manages this for you. It's all kind of in there ready to go. And so if I agree, I click accept, and it's routing me back to my local host, which is how I know it's successful. So we're good. So now the application has been, we've got permissions, we're ready to go. We've got connectivity between our Active Roles instance and our Azure instance. So let's go ahead and let's provision some users and just see what that's going to look like. I'm going to go back over to my Active Roles console. And this is pretty familiar for anybody who's used Active Roles before. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new OU here. And let's go ahead and do that. And we'll just call this one like Azure, just for fun. And we'll go ahead and finish it. And now I want to be able to provision users who are created in this administrative container into the, oh, that's the wrong one. It's down here. I want to be able to create provision users who are added to this Azure OU up into Azure in the cloud. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to enforce a policy. So in the new, inside of, we see kind of what's been enforced on the directory. Inside of 7.1, we have a new policy that we can enforce here. And again, this is just a standard kind of Active Roles policy, but it's right here. Azure default rules to generate properties. And you can do any of the things that you're sort of already familiar with inside of Active Roles in order to enforce naming standards or in order to enforce conventions. If you want to take a look at here, we can see it's generating a bunch of individual properties in here. And then there's one other thing that I want to do here is there's one other thing I want to do here, and that's I want to add a specific policy in here. So I'm going to go into properties, and I'm going to go into object. I'm going to go into advanced properties. And what I want to do is I want to set a specific Active Directory, or actually a specific virtual attribute to true. And so the one that I'm looking for is this one, which is right here. EDSVA Azure Office 365 enabled. And I'm going to edit that, and I'm going to set that equal to true. And so what that's going to do is it's going to say that anybody who's in here, who's in this particular OU, is going to be provisioned up to Azure Active Directory. So that's it. We're pretty much ready to go. Let me go ahead and show you how we're going to set up the provisioning. So what I'll do is I'm going to go back over to my web console here, and I'm going to expand. Let's see what we have. And you'll see I have this Azure container. And if I tick into the Azure container, I have the ability to add a new user. And you'll notice, well, let me show you, I'll show you kind of here. If I go into like my administrative accounts, for example, and I click new user, you'll notice because of the policy, we're not enforcing that policy. We're going to create an account and create a mailbox, but we're not going to create an Azure AD account. If I go into the Azure container and create a new user here, we have this create Azure account component. And so we'll go ahead and set this up. And let's call this guy like Adam Azure. I'll leave that. And we'll call him And again, you can use active roles, just your standard out of the regular active roles policies to manage all of these things. But in the interests of simplicity, I'll just do this manually. So we'll go ahead and create the Active Directory user, and that's been done. I'll give them a password. And we'll leave that. We'll click Next. I'm not going to create a mailbox, but I could. Click Next. And then here's where we're going to create the Azure account. So I'm going to take Create Azure Account. I'll give them a temporary password, which I think is just password1, which it was. And then this is kind of critical in the Azure environment. If you're going to want to assign an Office 365 license to this person, which is what we're going to do in the next step, you need to specify a usage location. And the reason for this is because Microsoft has different Office 365 licenses in different portions of the world. And so it needs to know where this user is going to be created in order to enable it. So for me, it's going to be US. And this policy is checked by active roles. So if I try to put something wrong in there, it'll yell at me. It should yell at me. Oh, it didn't yell at me. I screwed that up then. Well, we'll put it in US. Next. And then here I see the licenses that I've got here. So you'll notice that it's pulled down the licenses that I have associated with this particular account. I can decide which ones I want to enable. I'll assign this license to them. I'll go ahead and click Finish. And so now I see this user existing here inside of Active Directory. It's been provisioned in a standard way. If I go down to my Azure instance, I won't see that there. I need to go back up here to Active Directory. I need to go back in here. I need to go into Azure. And now I can select Atom Azure, and I can change his Azure properties here directly if I want to. So I can see what's in here and what licenses he has and manage it all from here without ever having to go back up into Azure. Just to verify that this user's been created, let's go to Users and Groups. And we'll say All Users. And here's Atom Azure. He's gone out and been provisioned. I can do the same thing and provision groups. So if I want to create a group in here, I'll just do it here just to make life easy. I say new group, same kind of thing. We'll call this, my group description. I don't need to, whatever. Same kind of thing. I'm not going to bother creating an email exchange, but I will create a group. I can go ahead and finish. There's my group. I can assign it to a user. And if I come up here, if I come back over to my Azure environment and I click all groups, I'll see my new group. And so again, from that single pane of glass, we can kind of configure kind of however we need to do. And again, all of the stuff that you're familiar with inside of active roles in terms of policies and whatnot, all just kind of automatically works. There's two things that I want to highlight, and then we'll probably just a couple notes, and then we'll probably finish up for today. If you don't want to use the web console and you prefer to use the PowerShell commandlets, we support that as well. And so I just kind of put a component up here. This is all documented in the Azure AD administration guide, but it's just the sort of the stuff that we've already done. This is how we create our users. This is how we create our configuration objects. The second thing I want to highlight is if you want to, it's rare that you're starting from scratch and you're just going to be provisioning from inside of active roles. It's far more common that you're going to be doing kind of administration maybe in both places, or you've got existing groups out there. In order to get the stuff that you have already up in Azure Active Directory back down into active roles, you've got a couple of options. One is that you can use the Azure AD Sync service provided by Microsoft. So if I go into and I go into Azure AD, there's a link in here to connect to configure Azure AD Connect, and you can set that up and then manage all that synchronization kind of on the Microsoft side of the house. However, you can also use a paradigm that you might be far more familiar with, especially if you're an existing Active Roles customer, and that's that I can use the Active Roles sync service. And so we have the ability to set up connections in here. I've already set up a connection into Active Roles. If I want to add a connection into Azure, I'll just call this typo. And specify a where is it? There it is, Windows Azure AD connector. And so this is a little bit of a different configuration mechanism, and I'll show you just how to configure that up. Same kind of idea. Same sort of idea. I'm going to configure, this time it's the Azure AD domain. It's not the tenant. So this is going to be georgeserbone.com. I'm also going to need a client ID and a key. And the way we configure that is over here. Back in my test domain, we have these app registrations. And what you're going to need to do is create a new web application. And I've sort of already created one in the interests of time. Except it seems like it's taking a second or two. It's the cloud. So what this is going to allow us to do is, again, it's a separate kind of connection. And so you'll see I have this application ID. You're going to create this as a web application and just give it any URL. I'm using just the local one here. So here's my application ID, and we're going to paste that in there. And then you need to generate a key. And the way you can do that is if you come over here to keys, you'll give it a key name. So we'll call this ARS key. And I don't really care about my duration. I'll just say it never expires. And then when I click save, I've got this value here. And it's important, you got to copy it now, because otherwise it'll disappear once you leave the screen. Copy it over here, hit my paste. And now if I test my connection, I'm connected. So now I have kind of the same ability to kind of go in here. The other thing that you need to be aware of is there is a required permission on this particular environment, and that's this guy, read and write directory data. And then once you've got that set up, it's just kind of standard, all of the stuff you're familiar with inside of the Active Roles synchronization service. So we probably won't go into that too much today, but you can then backsync your groups from the cloud and backsync your groups into Active Roles. So you got a couple of options there depending upon how you've already deployed your environment. There's some real advantages to using the Active Role Sync service versus using the Azure AD Sync, simply because it doesn't lock objects, and there's a variety of other things. So I think in the interest of time, they told me to go 30 minutes, and so we've done that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I'd encourage you guys to get access to Active Role 7.1 and start playing around with it. I've gone through all the sticky bits, which are really on the Azure side of the house. Getting it set up once you know kind of those things is really simple. So one other thing I'll leave you guys with, let me see if I can do this, is I bet you it's going to put me back at the beginning, isn't it? Yeah, it sure is. Oh no, it didn't. Okay, good. So I want to show one more kind of highlight here, and that's I want to talk a little bit about kind of what's coming in 7.2. So there's lots of great stuff that we've done here. Again, I mentioned at the very beginning that this is kind of our first foray into this idea of hybrid environments. We're only continuing to invest it, and so we're continuing to invest into our integration for hybrid. We're going to build in some improvements into Office 365, things like reporting on licenses and where they're being used, so that you can get a view of that. We're going to add a health check for that Azure connection, because as you probably figured out, that's really the hardest part of this thing, and Azure doesn't make it super easy, so we're gonna make it easy. Lots of other great stuff as well. But that's what we're going to be doing, and you can look for 7.2 coming in Q3 of this year. So it's an exciting time. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today on our very first inaugural Insight Series webcast, and I hope you see how we can use Active Roles to get IAM right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.